Welcome to Wrestling with Heart, a podcast looking at pro wrestlers giving back to their community. Join me, Stanley Carr, as I interview wrestling's hottest names who use their platforms as entertainers to raise awareness and do community service. Hello, and welcome to another edition of Wrestling with Heart. This is the show where we talk with professional wrestlers and professional wrestling personalities about their lives in and outside of the ring, as well as doing acts of charity work, community service, volunteering, and spreading positivity. We're all about the positive vibes here on the show. And I've got a very special guest with me. He is the author of a brand new book called For the Love of the Show, Pro Wrestling Fans Tell Their Stories. I'm pleased to welcome the one and only Dr. Jeremy Housewright. Jeremy, welcome to Wrestling with Heart.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah, my pleasure. So let's talk about your upbringing in childhood. Where are you from?
So I'm originally from Columbia, Illinois, which is about 10 minutes from St. Louis, Missouri. So while I grew up in Southern Illinois, I spent most of my childhood and teenage years over in St. Louis.
Yeah, okay, Midwest. How did you get into pro wrestling? Was it something you watched growing up as a kid, something you later followed? How'd you get into wrestling?
Yeah, I've followed pro wrestling since I was a little boy. My grandfather used to take me over to the Kiel Auditorium, which is now the what's it called? The Stifle Theater. And from there we used to, we'd go to shows on Friday or Saturday nights when WWF was in town. That's when Hogan was in his heyday. So I grew up a devout Hulk Hogan fan. And he'd take me over to the arena then, which is where the Blues used to play. And we'd go to all the shows there. I don't think we ever missed a show back in the late 80s, early 90s. I mean, we were always there every time they were in town. And then I started watching Monday Night Wrestling on my own with Gorilla Monsoon and Bobby Heenan, and watched WCW as well growing up. And so yeah, I've been a longtime follower of pro wrestling.
Long-time follower. I love it, man. Who were some of your favorites to watch?
Well, obviously, as a kid, it was Hogan. I also was a fan of Jake the Snake Roberts as a kid. As I got a little bit older, I'd say, I was a fan of, obviously, when I was a teenager, Stone Cold Steve Austin, D-Generation X, even Goldberg for a time when I was in high school. I followed Goldberg when the streak was hot and heavy. Obviously legends like Ric Flair, Harley Race, those guys were always on my mind. Being from St. Louis, they were around here a lot. Mr. Perfect. Now I'd say I've been a CM Punk follower for years. He's my guy. Mm-hmm. Cody Rhodes and probably Swerve Strickland is another one of the guys I really enjoy watching. So yeah, there's a lot of them that I really enjoy following.
What made you decide to write this book, For the Love of the Show? Because this is a really interesting topic. You're trying to interview wrestling fans about how they got into it, and you don't really hear much about that. So it's really unique. It's a unique concept.
So I'm a sports writer by trade. I went to school for a bachelor's in journalism and covered sports right out of college. Actually, while I was still in high school, they had me covering football games in town. And so I've been a sports writer for years, and I branched off in entertainment writing and covering musicians and comedians. And I mean, I've interviewed presidents and covered murder trials. So I've kind of done it all.
Wow.
And people always told me that the style of writing I use to write my sports articles, whether it be covering the Rams or the Missouri Tigers or the Blues hockey team, always made them feel like they were right there when they read it. And so, they always told me you need to write a book. And my whole thing was, I didn't know what to write a book about. I had several ideas over the years pop into my head, but nothing really stuck. And I started traveling to WrestleManias and other big wrestling shows with a couple friends of mine. Our first WrestleMania together was WrestleMania 30 in New Orleans. And we started going every year. And I guess my first real kind of thought about this book would have been WrestleMania 33. I met a friend from Canada named Joey, who just happened to walk up to us at the Hall of Fame ceremony and start talking to us. And we became really close friends. He actually traveled here to St. Louis to stay with me, and I took him up to Kansas City for a Chiefs game. And, and then the following year we were at the original, I guess it was All In for when Cody and all them put together that indie show in Chicago. And
the AEW the next year.
Yeah. And met a couple guys from LA and became buddies with them. And, a couple years later, we all traveled to Vegas together to go to Double or Nothing when Punk won the title. And so I started thinking about it. I'm like, man, I've met some really cool people. I have some really great stories from just traveling that are in the book about going to this hotel that was basically like a drug den and having to leave in the middle of the night in Orlando during Mania. And I thought, man, there's got to be other people with crazy stories. Or that's how it started, is like kind of outlandish stories. And as I started kind of talking to some fans, I started getting stories that were very inspirational. And being someone who's in education, a teacher and a former administrator, I thought, man, this is where I want to go with this, kind of inspiring, motivational stories that wrestling has provided for some fans. And so I just started talking to fans, and some reached out to me with their stories. And I was able to kind of pick and choose a few that really resonated with me, that I had kind of a connection to. And so that's kind of how the book came to be. I started working on it about 2 years ago. And it was a slow process at first, but probably the last year I really, really focused on it and started putting a lot of work into it. I mean, several hours a week, if not multiple hours a day, and got it done, and it released early November.
Wow, that's so amazing. And kind of like with our podcast, it provides an outlet for wrestling fans and wrestlers alike to hear and listen and share stories of things that they are going through in their lives, and they can pass it on to someone that surely can be inspired. And so your book is doing that with for the love of the show, and it causes so many different emotions. It brings people together. It can make you laugh. It can make you cry. It's a pretty awesome form of entertainment, whether it's an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours a week. And your book definitely does a phenomenal job of documenting just how passionate people are about professional wrestling. Let's kind of switch gears now and talk about some of the charity work that you've done over the years and community service work that you've done. I know you've mentioned that you're a teacher, you've worked in education. Tell me about some of the stuff you've done in your community as an educator.
Well, the thing here in Missouri is teachers are so low paid. I think we're the 49th lowest paying state in the nation for teachers. And that's a shame, because this is my 16th year in education, and I was drawn to it because I had an 8th grade basketball coach who was a mentor to me as an 8th grader. I'll never forget, we did this lesson. He used to do these things called life skills lessons every day. And he did this one on finding your identity. And as an 8th grader, I'm like, well, I know my name, I know my identity. And he said, that's not what I'm talking about here. And it wasn't until a few years later in high school I started thinking back about it. And I'm like, yeah, I get it. I get what he's talking about. Be yourself, be your true person. Don't be a follower, don't be like, we call marks in the business. Don't be a mark, be yourself. And that stuck with me my entire life. And he was such a great mentor to me. He was actually the best man in my wedding 15 years ago.
Wow.
And so I decided, after getting my journalism degree, after a couple of years, I'm like, I'm going to go back to school and get an education degree, because I want to coach. I want to teach. I want to have the impact on kids that this guy had on me. And, so I did that. And I started out in the inner city of St. Louis, and one of the poorest schools you could think of. And it was rough, man. I was right between blood and Crip territory. Fights every day, probably 3, 4, 5 fights a day. And these were 7th and 8th graders.
Wow.
Stayed there for 2 years coaching, and started the basketball program, which After 2 years, we were beating JV teams. My 8th grade team would go into a JV team's gym and put 100 points on them. That's how good we were. But we kept these kids from, getting involved in the gang life. And, so from there, I went kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. I went to rural Missouri and coached there and worked with those kids. And, now that I'm a little older and seeing some of these kids who are now 29, 30 years old with kids and getting married, and I'll be out somewhere and they'll come up and start talking to me. And it really gives me just a positive vibe just to know that, I had some type of an impact on their life, whether it be, and most of the time it's because I was just nice to them. And I'm a joke teller. I like to talk, and tell stories, and they love that about my class. They love to hear all about my journalism background and working with wrestlers and things like that. They think it's so cool. And that's what they remember, and, I'm not going to get upset that they don't remember anything about my English subject that I taught, but they remember my stories, which is still cool, So I think just knowing that I have a positive impact on a lot of these students' lives, no matter how minor it may be, but the fact that they can think back and have a positive memory of their teenage years when it's probably some of the toughest times in their lives. Mm-hmm. And I was a part of that makes me feel pretty good. The teachers that helped me as a kid, and there were a couple, obviously my 8th grade history teacher, John, was the big one, but I can think of a 7th grade English teacher. I can think of a 4th grade teacher who I loved, but here's the funny thing. There was an algebra teacher I had in 8th grade who I hated, could not stand him. He gave me a 30% in the class. It was a special class that somehow I got picked to be in because I was good in math at the time. And then after that, I was horrible in math. But he was the worst. At the time, I thought he was the worst teacher. He would give me 50 problems a night. And he always had this saying. He was from New Jersey. And being in the Midwest, his accent really stuck out. And he'd always say, "It's your grade, not mine." And I'll never forget one day I muttered that to a student. I'm like, Jesus, man. I'm like, Mr. Martin's rubbing off on me. But he passed away a few years back. And I remember thinking, I'm like, he really was a great teacher. He taught me a lot about just doing the work. Even though I wasn't doing it right and doing it well, I put in the work. And then I thought about one of the worst teachers that a bad experience with teaching. And I tell my students this. I had written this 10-page paper as a sophomore in high school for an English class. And I had worked like crazy on it. It was about defending sexist lyrics in rap music. Basically how rap music was coming under fire back then for bad lyrics. And, they were out busting all the CDs. All the government officials were doing that. And so I wrote a paper basically defending freedom of speech, 10 pages. I had another teacher edit it. I worked like crazy on it. And I got it back from this English teacher, and it was a C-, which broke my heart. And at the bottom, she wrote, "You need to find a new profession. You will never work in media." And at first, I was really mad about it. I'm like, I wanted to go like tell her off. And I went home and I told my mom, and my mom really didn't do nothing about it. So I went to my grandfather, and I think I was in tears over it. I'm like, I really worked hard on this. This ain't right. Why would this lady tell me this? And he goes, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" I said, "What do you mean?" And I'm thinking, well, do you want me to go like pop her tires on her car or something or what? He's like, "No, what are you going to do about it to prove her wrong?" And from that day on, I kept that essay in a locker, or I kept it above my bed, and I would look at it every day as a motivator to prove her wrong, And I'll never forget one night I was coming home from a Blues game. I had just covered the Blues for an outlet here in St. Louis, and she was on the train. And she said, "Oh, Mr. Housewright, how you doing?" And I just held up my press pass. I said, "Boom, I work in the media." And I just walked away. I didn't say hi to her. I was like, no, man, because, I would never do that to a student, no matter how much they made me mad. And there's been some that I can't tolerate. Like, I just wish would go away. But I would never crush their hopes and dreams, no matter how ridiculous they may be.
Yeah.
I always tell my students, if you want to do it, if you can dream about it, you can do it. No matter how ridiculous it may seem, I'm never going to crush a dream because of that experience I had. And that's always stuck with me. And I share that with my students a lot. And they just look at me like, we can't believe a teacher did that to you. I'm like, yeah, it was a different time back then. Now, if a teacher would do that, they'd probably fire her. I mean, to be honest with you, I mean, I turned a negative into a positive. And that's what I like to share with the students is I could have given up on my dream right then. Said, you know what, I'm never going to, work in the media because of my drive from that one instance.
Yeah, look at you. You've done so well with your career. You got this awesome book, and you're doing well with teaching students and education. Yeah, you got a lot to be thankful for and to be proud of. Jeremy, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on the show. It means a lot to me and to my listeners and viewers. You're welcome. Where can people find more about you on social media? Where can people find the book and more information about where you can get the book?
So the book is for sale on Amazon.com and BarnesandNoble.com. You can find me on Facebook under J.M. Housewright, and I'm also on Instagram under Dr. Jeremy Housewright. And if you really want a signed copy, you can reach out to me on either of those platforms, and we can take care of it through there, and I'll sign a copy and mail it to you. But yeah, you can get it on Amazon and Barnes and Noble.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to get a copy. It sounds really cool. What you're doing is so awesome. So thanks again so much, and you're more than welcome to come back.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem. Take care.
All right, you too.
This is Wrestling with Heart. I hope you found this podcast to be informative and entertaining. If you did, please hit the subscribe button and look out for the next edition.